dive into something pretty intense. We're talking forensic pathology. Today we're tackling a question that one of you sent in, how investigators can tell if an infant was born alive, especially in suspected neonaticide cases. And we got a ton of research to unpack, to do at articles, even a whole chapter from a textbook on child homicide.
Heavy stuff, for sure. It's a question people have been grappling with forever, really. How to know for sure, did a baby live, even for a moment outside the room? That question has huge implications, legally, ethically, you name it.
Right, even defining neonaticide isn't as simple as you might think.
Yeah, you're right on there. Neonaticide, infanticide. The definitions, the laws, they change all over the map depending on where you are in the world. But what keeps forensic experts up at night, the core issue, is proving live birth. Did a baby die after being born, or was it stillborn? And that is not an easy question to answer.
Especially since, and this is just heartbreaking, but we probably only know about a tiny fraction of neonaticide cases.
Absolutely. So many of these cases, they involve concealment, unreported births. It's really tough to get a handle on how often neonaticide actually happens. It's grim to think about how many cases probably go undiscovered.
So, say investigators do suspect neonaticide. Where do they even begin?
Well, first, often they have to figure out who the mother even is. You can imagine, with concealment and all, that's a huge challenge on its own. And even when they do, it's about figuring out her intent. Did she deliberately end the infant's life? Or was it a stillbirth? Proving live birth. That's often the key to answering that question. And that's where the real detective work comes in.
Which brings us to the heart of this whole deep dive. How do experts figure out if an infant was born alive?
For ages, they use something called the lung float test. Sounds almost too simple, right?
Yeah, I can already tell this isn't going to be good. I've watched enough crime shows to know better.
You're right to be skeptical. The lung float test, it was the thing for a long time. The idea was if a baby had breathed air, its lungs would float in water. Simple, right? Turns out, way too simple.
Let me guess. A whole bunch of things can make a stillborn's lungs float.
Exactly. Decomposition, for one. Or if someone tried to resuscitate the infant, that can do it too.
So you could actually convict someone wrongly based on this test. Yikes.
It's a harsh reminder why forensic science can never stand still. We've learned the hard way. There's no one perfect test, especially with something this sensitive.
So if the lung float test is out, what are they looking at now?
Yeah.
You sent over some research about the umbilical cord. I always thought that was just about whether a baby was full term or not.
Nope, the umbilical cord can tell us so much more, like how long an infant lived after birth, for instance. Yeah, see, there's this reddish ring that can form at the base of the cord. Means the baby lived for at least a day or two, maybe more, because it's a sign of healing, like your body's trying to fix itself. And they look at how the cord was severed too. Clean cut, usually that means someone who knows what they're doing, like a doctor or midwife. But a torn end could point to a more panicked, unattended birth.
Every little detail matters. It's like a giant puzzle, huh?
You got it. And sometimes the pieces are tiny. That's where things like immunohistochemistry come in.
Whoa, slow down. You lost me back there. Immunohissy. What now?
Don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds. Basically, it's a way to find specific proteins in tissues. Think of it like a black light at a crime scene. It can show you things you'd never see otherwise.
Okay, I think I get that. But what does that have to do with the umbilical cord?
Well, researchers, guys like Neary and his team, they found that certain proteins, they show up differently in infants who were born alive versus stillborn. They're still figuring out all the details, but it could be huge for these cases.
So it's like looking at the umbilical cord on a whole other level, seeing things we couldn't before. Pretty wild. But what about the lungs themselves? If just looking at them isn't enough, what else do they do?
You have to remember, it's not always a yes or no answer. It's more like a spectrum.
The spectrum, okay.
Yeah, so on one end, you've got the classic stillborn infant's lungs. Dark, dense, they look kind of like liver almost. And then on the other end, you've got lungs from an infant who's been breathing, doing their thing, pink, kind of mottled looking, spongy, full of air.
So where does it get tricky?
That middle ground, when a baby might have only taken a couple of breaths, really weak ones. Those changes, they're subtle, open to interpretation, you know?
So the pathologist has to tell those tiny changes apart from decomposition, or like you were saying before, what happens if there were attempts to resuscitate the baby? That's a really tough job.
It is, but luckily there are more tools now than there used to be. One thing they might do is look for air in the lungs using something called the ear crepitance test.
The ear crepitance test. Okay, that one just sounds creepy. Tell me more.
So picture this, the pathologist, they take a little piece of lung tissue, rub it between their fingers right near their ear, and they listen for this really faint crackling sound.
Wait, really?
Yep. If the baby took a breath, there are going to be tiny little air bubbles trapped in the lung tissue. And those bubbles, they make a sound. That's the crepitation.
Okay, that's both super cool and kind of disturbing. Don't think I've ever heard of that one before. But what if someone did try to resuscitate the baby? Wouldn't that mess things up with this test?
Totally. That's when they got to look at the whole picture. Medical records, if they have any, and how the air is spread out inside the lungs. A lung that's been breathing normally, it's going to look different than one that someone's been doing CPR on.
This is making me think of something else I saw in your notes. PMCT and PMMRI. Are those, like, the gold standard now for these types of cases? I'm guessing those are post-mortem computed tomography and post-mortem magnetic resonance imaging, right? It's crazy how much tech has changed things.
You got those abbreviations down pat. And yeah, they're super valuable tools. PMCT especially, it lets you see how the air is sitting in the lungs without having to cut anything open.
So you can see, like, if the air is all spread out evenly, which would mean the baby was breathing on its own, versus being all clumped in one spot, which could be from, like, a breathing tube or something.
Exactly. And it's not just the lungs either. PMCT, it can even sometimes tell the difference between air that got in there naturally and air that got in there from someone doing CPR. There was this study by Mishu and his team. They found that sometimes live-born babies who died soon after birth had, like, patchy air in their lungs, maybe because they were sick or something. But then a stillborn baby who had CPR, their air distribution looked different. It just goes to show PMCT can really paint a more detailed picture than we used to get.
Yeah, definitely beats dropping lungs in a bucket.
Eh.
But are there downsides to all this fancy tech? Or is it basically foolproof now?
Well, as amazing as it is, it's not perfect. The biggest thing is still decomposition.
Right, because a body that's been outside or something, yeah, that's not going to be pretty.
Exactly. If it's been long enough, the gas buildup, it can make it super hard to see what's going on in the scans. But even with that, PMCT and PMMRI, they're game changers.
It's like having a permanent record, right? You can always go back and check.
Exactly. So important in cases like these. Okay, so we've got the umbilical cord, the lungs, all this awesome imaging. What about other signs? What if they find food in the baby's stomach? That's got to mean the baby was alive long enough to eat, right?
100%. Finding food in the stomach, that's strong evidence of live birth. It means they were sucking, swallowing, all that stuff you obviously can't do in the womb.
So that's a slam dunk.
Yeah.
You'd think so, but the sad truth is, with a lot of these neonaticide cases, the infant dies so soon after birth, there just hasn't been time to feed them. So that clue, it's often missing.
Which brings us back to those tiny, almost invisible clues. Speaking of, what about injuries? I bet those are really hard to figure out in a newborn. How can you tell what happened during birth versus what might have been done on purpose?
That is one of the toughest parts, for sure. Let's say head injuries, for example. Sometimes a really rough delivery or one that happens super fast can cause problems. Skull fractures, bleeding in the brain, things like that. Especially if the baby was breech or they had to use forceps or a vacuum.
So a traumatic birth, that could look like abuse. That's scary.
It's true. And that's why pathologists, they have to be so careful. They look at where the injuries are, how much force it would take to make them, do they match up with what people are saying about the birth? It's all about context.
I'm sensing a theme here. Black and white answers are hard to come by in these situations.
You got that right. And it's not just if there are injuries, it's the type too. Like with skull fractures. The ones that are more like a crack, those are more common with birth trauma. But the ones where the skull's actually dented in, those usually mean a more focused impact, like from a hit or something.
Wow. So even the smallest thing, like what kind of fracture it is, it can mean something totally different depending on the case. It's like forensic pathology is all about reading between the lines, isn't it?
100%. And it's not always about injuries someone did. Sometimes it's about what they didn't do.
You mean like neglecting the baby?
Exactly. As awful as it is to think about not taking care of a baby's basic needs, that is a form of neonaticide too. Things like not feeding them, leaving them out in the cold.
But how do you prove that was deliberate? What if the mom said she was overwhelmed, didn't know what she was doing? It's just so sad.
It really is. The pathologist might see signs of dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, those kinds of things, but that on its own, It doesn't necessarily mean that someone meant to harm the baby.
So that's where everyone has to work together, right? The
Yeah.
pathologists, the detectives, doctors, everybody.
Yep, they look at everything, the medical stuff, the scene, what witnesses say, even psychological evaluations of the mother. It
Yeah.
all matters. Each case, it's this huge, complicated puzzle, and it takes a team to put it together.
Sounds like every case comes with its own unique challenges. No easy answers here.
Not at all. And that just shows how important the forensic pathologist's job is. It's not just about finding answers, it's about getting it right. It's about understanding how sensitive these cases are, how heartbreaking they are, and doing everything possible to find the truth.
And that takes us to the ethical side of all this, which,
It's a huge responsibility. You got to remember, in these cases, a false positive saying the baby was born alive when it wasn't. That's way worse than a false negative.
because you could be accusing a mother of something she didn't do. Talk about pressure. It's no wonder these cases are treated so carefully.
Absolutely. They have to look at it from every angle, every single one, and think, okay, what else could explain this? They can't forget for a second what's at stake here.
Which is why forensic science is always changing, always trying to find more definitive answers. Even though, like we've been talking about, sometimes those answers are really hard to find.
Exactly. That research into new stuff, like that immunohistochemistry we talked about, that's promising. And the imaging, every year, it gets more and more detailed, showing us more than we could see before.
It's like we're always getting closer to the truth, even if we never get all the answers.
You got it. And it's not just about the science part, the human part. What was the mother going through? What happened during the birth? What was her intention? That's all still crucial. We can look at the physical stuff all day, but to understand the why behind these awful situations, you need that human element. The interpretation, the different experts working together.
It's a good reminder that even with all the tech in the world, we're still dealing with people, with emotions.
Yeah.
And that makes these cases even more complicated.
100%. Finding that balance. The objective science, and then that compassion, understanding the human side of it.
That's a lot to take in. We've covered so much, the old lung flow test, the new imaging tech. It's amazing how far things have come.
It really is. And as things keep changing, who knows what's next, right? What do we be able to do in 10, 20 years?
Like that saying, change is the only constant, especially in a field like this.
You got it. And with the new stuff that's coming out, it's not just, oh, cool, new tech. It's how do we use this the right way? Because the more we can do, the more careful we got to be, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Especially with something like neonaticide, where the stakes are so high.
Hmm.
A mother's life could change completely based on this evidence. We have to get it right.
That's the thing. To get it wrong, to convict someone because of bad evidence or because we didn't understand something, that's why everyone in this field, they have to be so thorough, so open to every possibility. They can't stop looking for those answers, even when it seems impossible.
And they have to remember each case is different. No cutting corners, no assumptions.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about bodies and evidence. It's about real people, real families, and trying to find justice, no matter how hard that is.
Deep stuff. A real deep dive for sure.
It has been. We've talked about how they figured out live birth in the past, how the techniques have changed, all that cool new imaging stuff, and how important the ethics are, working together, all of it.
And this is just scratching the surface, really.
It is. But if our listener remembers one thing, I hope it's this. Figuring out live birth in these cases, it's almost never easy. You got to look closely, understand what you're seeing, and never stop asking questions, pushing the limits of what we know.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, listener, here's something to think about. As forensic science keeps getting better, what do you think will be the next big thing that helps us understand these cases? And how do we make sure it's used the right way? It's definitely something to ponder. Keep those minds working, keep those questions coming, and as always, keep diving deep. Makes you wonder, what's next? What will forensic science be able to do that we can't even imagine yet?
Right. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how far we've come. From that lung float test, which, let's be real, sounds totally archaic now, to all the stuff we can do today.
Cool.
Who knows what's coming next?
Like you were saying before, change is the only constant, especially in this line of work.
And with those changes, it's not just about the science itself, it's about, like, the ethics of it, you know?
Yeah.
Are we using this knowledge the right way? Because we've got all these tools now, but that means we got to be even more careful about how we use them.
For sure. And nowhere is that more important than in these neonaticide cases. Because, like we've been talking about, someone's life could depend on this. Getting it wrong is not an option.
Absolutely not. If we ever convict someone based on bad information, on us not understanding the science, that'd be awful. It's a huge burden to carry, you know? Knowing how much is riding on every decision, that's why everyone working on these cases, they have to be so careful, so thorough, and never stop learning, never stop looking for those answers, even when it seems impossible.
And remembering that no two cases are the same. Each one, it's its own unique situation. No shortcuts, no easy answers.
Right. It always comes back to that. These aren't just cases, they're people's lives,
Yeah.
families, and everyone deserves justice, however complicated that ends up being.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive.
Yeah.
Intense, but important.
It has been. We covered a lot of ground, how they used to try to figure out live birth, all the ways it's done now, the tech, the ethics, the whole 9 yards.
And like you said earlier, we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah. But if someone's listening to this, thinking about all this stuff, if they take away one thing, I hope it's that these cases, they're never simple. There's no magic bullet. It takes real work, looking at every detail, really understanding it, and never being afraid to ask questions to push the boundaries of what we know.
I like that. Never stop questioning. So to wrap things up, listener, here's something to chew on. As forensic science keeps advancing, what do you think will be the game changer for these kinds of cases? What's the next big breakthrough going to be? And how do we make sure we're ready for it, ethically speaking? That's something to think about, for sure. Keep those brains buzzing, folks, and until next time, keep diving deep.